Quexkina nenoda Thérèse Ottawa indígenicazon, Manawan nutzin, Atikamekw, Krigazanagudik Nugumes, Nastasia Herold Kazo, Tsarman Squejish, Ngueroger kan mitats armuewinyo, Neazegui armut batnan kakijo de mirtok yama. Manawan de Dekera Wikipedia Atikamekw Rumuin Kajin Kazgadek. Nigats. Angun Atikamekw Quebec Jashto. Angun Gizek Rajta Denisizik Ubijuan, Wimotashi Krigaza Manawan.
As Thérèse showed you, the Atikamekw are situated in Quebec, Canada. The nation has a population of 8,000 people who live in 3 communities. 97% of the Atikamekw speak their native language as mother tongue, which is the highest percentage for all indigenous languages in Canada. Atikamekw is traditionally an oral language only. In the 1990s, the computer found its way also to the First Nations in Canada, and especially the young generations use it regularly. Communication takes place more and more often digitally, and this in written language rather than orally. During my field study in the Atikamekw community Manawan in 2013, it became obvious that Atikamekw is the main language in oral conversations, but on the web this First Nation reads and publishes mainly in French, which is the second language of the Atikamekw. And this despite the fact that the Atikamekw language has a standardized orthography and is taught as first language at the primary school. So in order to bring the Atikamekw language in a sustainable manner on the web, where it would be used for a long period, we looked for a platform that young Atikamekw would use actively, where young Atikamekw and everyone can contribute, and which is open access, because with open access, the data is freely accessible and usable. It's for everyone and it's for free. And all this is very important for a project we wanted to do with, the Atikamekw wanted to do. So all this is given at Wikipedia, and this is why we choose Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a multilingual web-based free encyclopedia based on a model of openly editable viewable content, a wiki, and the owner is the Wikimedia Foundation. So after getting the permission of different school and administration councils, the computer science teacher and me started the project as a school project in the computer science lessons of 10th and 11th grade at the secondary school of Manawan. The students were asked to write during the lessons only articles in the Atikamekw, on the Atikamekw culture, history, personalities, places, flora, fauna. Yes, and the local language expert was always present and still is to give them comfort in writing in their own language. In order to realize a project that puts indigenous knowledge on the World Wide Web, it is only possible when you work hand in hand with the nation, or as it is in our case, you give the full power to the nation itself. It was a long way to the very vital, frequently used, and always developing Atikamekw Wikipedia that we have today. And from the lessons we learned, we would like to show you 4 examples that demonstrate how respect and responsibility can guide to an indigenous controlled and used, very successful open access project. For Wikipedia, it is important to note that the Wikimedia Foundation will ask you first to write all articles into a test wiki, the so-called Wikimedia Incubator, before they create a Wikipedia in a new language for you. In order to receive our real Wikipedia, which is called Wikipedia Atikamekw, which homepage you see here, We had, among other things, to realize 800 translations of the Wikipedia interface. Fortunately, we got a lot of help from Wikimedia Canada because there was a lot of computer science terms that ordinary computer users don't know. So we organized translation meetings in person and also in video conferences where we put together elders who know the Atikamekw language very well, Atikamekw Wikipedia contributors, and also very active members and administrators of Wikimedia Canada. The Wikipedia experts explained the French computer science words, and the Atikamekw language experts discussed its translations. It was important to create neologisms that every Atikamekw who contributes to the new Wikipedia would understand. I would like to give you some examples of these translation meetings. The biggest challenge for the translations was to combine the indigenous universe and the computer universe. One challenge was also the language structure, because the Atikamekw language has no male or female nouns, but the language is affected from the question if the subject is animate or inanimate. And we have, for example, the word mouse, the computer mouse. And the Atikamekw said, well, we do have a word for the animal mouse, which is abgushish, but this is animate. An animal is animate. But here we're talking about a device, and we don't want a device to have an animate word. So they looked for a new word. And so they were thinking about this computer mouse, what happens, and it is a device to press. They have a word for press and they have an ending for device, so they put together device to press, which is magunagan, and they created this new neologism. Then there is another new word, which is click. They don't need this word, so it doesn't well, first they don't need it, so they don't have a Atikamekw word for it. So they were thinking, okay, what happens when you click on something? And when you click on a word, for example, something gets changed. So they translated to get something changed into Atikamekw, and this is the new word for click. And then there's also the word folder. They had already words for writings or documents, which is mazinaikan, and then a container has the ending wush, so they put it together, mazinaikani wush, and this is the new word for folder. The second example from the project I want to explain is part of the question, what's the goal or what's the reason of the project? The goal of Wikipedia Atikamekw is to keep the language alive by using it on the web in a written form. So it's not in the first instance made for academics who would like to make a scientific research, but it's primarily for the active use of the Atikamekw. For example, during lessons for the monolingual Atikamekw students at the primary schools. Therefore, it was important to consider their language use. The Atikamekw language varies depending on the age of the speakers, their gender, their family clan, and also their dialect. And whereas Wikipedia and other languages chose only one standard, for example, I remind you on differences of the English in the UK, in India, or in Canada, but one English Wikipedia. The Atikamekw decided to divide their articles respecting at least the dialect of the authors. So in all the Atikamekw articles, Atikamekw language articles, this year, for example, you see the Atikamekw, which is the whitefish, and in this article there exists content only on the Manawan Wamotashi dialect, not yet in the Obichi-1 dialect. but this will happen one day probably. So you see it's always divided into two dialects, and then the speakers of each dialect can put the content in it. Here you can see another example. This is the article in the Manawan Wimotashi dialect on how to prepare a fillet of a fish. Another rule the Atikamekw made up is on the references. Usually the English, French or German Wikipedia only allows written sources, but for the Atikamekw oral transmission is traditionally more important than written sources, and this is why on the Atikamekw Wikipedia oral sources are allowed. And in the guidelines, the format for such an oral reference is stated. And the fourth example is on sacred knowledge. According to the Atikamekw culture, sacred topics like secret ceremonies or medical use of plants can be transmitted only orally. So it is forbidden to write information on it in a Wikipedia Atikamekw Neromowin article. This is why in the articles of plants, like here you can see kijik, which is white cedar, you will not read anything of its medical use because the Atikamekw don't want it. Today, more than 1,200 articles have been published at atj.wikipedia.org, and many Atikamekw of all ages work on the content and the development of Wikipedia Atikamekw Neromowin. This was only possible by respecting the Atikamekw culture in their open access project. So to summarize the efforts in our project, we, the contributors to Wikipedia Atikamekw Neromowin, recommend to answer Rebein's and T's responsibility question before you start any kind of open access project. Who is responsible for what, to who, before which instance, to which standards? So for Wikipedia Atikamekw Neromowin, this means that a private person, nation member, teacher, student, participant, academic, administrator, author, native speaker, or photographer is responsible for translation they do, the text they produce or edit they do, the pictures they upload, the rules they establish and observe, and they or we are responsible to the Atikamekw First Nation, other participants of Wikipedia Atikamekw Neromowin, and the Wikimedia Foundation, before the Atikamekw First Nation, the administrators of Wikipedia, the Wikimedia Foundation, and our own conscience, and this to the standards of the ethics of the Atikamekw First Nation, the rules of Wikipedia and the Wikimedia Foundation, to applicable laws, and to the Atikamekw orthography. We hope this presentation will well contribute to the digital humanities discussions on ethics and responsibilities for open access publications, and that it demonstrates well the indispensability of networking in order to develop responsible open access projects. Please feel free to ask us questions and to discuss the content. And together with Thérèse, we thank you for your attention. And we thank the organizers of the H2020 for the reorganization of the Congress.
Miigwet, Ekibendo Tumek, Matsashuk Skina.